The year is approximately 621 BC, and the city-state of Athens is on the precipice of total social and political collapse. For generations, the city has been governed by an elite group of aristocrats who interpreted unwritten laws to suit their own financial and political interests, leaving the common citizens in a state of perpetual, agonizing uncertainty. The terrifying truth is that justice in early Athens was not a public right, but a private weapon used by the powerful to crush the weak. Blood feuds between noble clans turned the streets into a theater of constant low-level warfare, where a single insult could trigger generations of revenge. In this atmosphere of chaos and impending revolution, the desperate citizens demanded that the laws be written down so that no judge could ever again manipulate the rules in secret. The man chosen for this monumental task was Draco, a figure whose name would become a permanent, chilling synonym for cruelty and unyielding severity. Draco did not seek to bring peace through compromise. He sought to enforce order through a level of systemic terror that the world had never seen before. He believed that the only way to save Athens from itself was to create a legal code where every transgression, no matter how small, was treated as a terminal threat to the state. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire deep dive documentary and subscribe to Crown of Dread, and you will learn the one shocking record that proves Draco's laws were so severe they had to be written in human blood to satisfy the city's demands for order. The terror began not with a coup, but with the scratching of a stylus on a stone tablet that promised death for the smallest sin. Draco's mission was to replace the unpredictable violence of blood feuds with the absolute, predictable violence of the state. Before his code, if a man was murdered, his family was expected to track down the killer and take their own revenge, leading to cycles of violence that decimated the population. Draco intervened by decreeing that the state alone had the right to punish, but the punishments he chose were designed to be so final and so terrifying that no one would ever dare to offend again. The most chilling aspect of the Draconian Code was its lack of proportion. It did not matter if you had committed a cold-blooded assassination or if you had simply stolen a handful of grain from a neighbor's field to feed your starving children. In Draco's court, the penalty for both was the same: immediate and public execution. This was a radical and terrifying form of social engineering, a total war against any form of disorder. This situation illustrates the terrifying historical precedent of a ruler using absolute legal clarity to mask absolute moral cruelty. Draco showed that when a state is desperate for order, it will often embrace a tyrant who promises that blood will wash away the chaos. The psychological impact of Draco's laws on the citizens of Athens was one of profound, paralyzing dread that transformed the daily life of the city into a survival game. The legal code was inscribed on large, rotating wooden tablets called axons, which were placed in the public square for all to see. However, for the illiterate majority, the only thing they needed to understand was the repeated mention of the death penalty for almost every recorded crime. Walking through the market or interacting with a neighbor became a high-stakes encounter where a single mistake or a perceived theft could lead to the gallows. This atmosphere of total legal surveillance turned the city into a silent, fearful community where trust was a luxury no one could afford. Draco believed that small crimes were the seeds of large rebellions, and by pruning the smallest offenders, he was protecting the survival of the elite. This demonstrates the ultimate historical danger of a legal system that values the stability of the state over the life of the individual. Draco proved that a law can be perfectly clear and still be perfectly monstrous. The elite families of Athens, while initially supporting Draco to protect their property, soon found that the monster they had created was beginning to threaten their own security. The Draconian Code was so rigid and so unyielding that even the nobility could find themselves targeted by a rival clan using the law as a tool of legal assassination. A minor financial dispute or a disagreement over a border could now be escalated into a capital offense where the state was forced to execute the loser. This terrifying reality meant that the aristocrats who had commissioned Draco were now living in the same state of perpetual fear as the peasants they sought to control. The law had become a living, breathing entity that demanded a constant stream of victims to maintain its authority. This illustrates the historical reality that systemic terror eventually consumes those who initiate it. Draco showed that a code built on blood knows no loyalty and will eventually turn its cold gaze on the very hands that helped write it. The fear in the council chambers was as thick as the fear in the slums. The most enduring and terrifying secret of Draco's reign is the reason why he believed his punishments were justified, a logic that reveals the chilling mind of a fanatical legalist. When asked why he had made death the penalty for almost all offenses, Draco reportedly replied that small crimes deserve death, and for great crimes, he could find no penalty more severe. This complete lack of a moral scale is the hallmark of the Draconian mind, a belief that any transgression against the law is an infinite offense that requires an infinite punishment. This was not the work of a madman, but the work of a man who believed that mercy was a form of weakness that invited disaster. The silence of the Athenian streets under his rule was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a population that was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the laws would finally be replaced. This illustrates the terrifying historical function of the legal tyrant. Draco proved that order can be achieved through terror, but it is a hollow, fragile order that lasts only as long as the executioner's blade is sharp. We have seen the birth of the code, but the ultimate fate of the man who wrote it in blood is yet to be revealed. The implementation of Draco's code marked the end of the age of oral tradition and the beginning of a terrifying new era where the word of the law was absolute, inflexible, and lethal. Before these laws were carved into the wooden axons, justice was a matter of social standing and family influence. But Draco's written word created a cold, impersonal machine that operated with the same indifference as a natural disaster. The most devastating impact of this legal revolution was felt by the poorest citizens of Athens, the tenant farmers and laborers who lived on the edge of survival. For them, the draconian laws were not a shield against aristocratic abuse, but a trap designed to finalize their enslavement. The terrifying truth is that under Draco's regime, debt became a crime practically equivalent to treason. If a farmer failed to pay his rent or fell behind on a loan, the law did not merely take his property, it took his body. Debt bondage was the silent executioner of the Athenian lower class, where a man could be sold into foreign slavery or forced into a lifetime of unfree labor to pay back a trivial sum. This demonstrates the ultimate historical use of law as an engine of economic exploitation. Draco showed that by making the consequences of poverty fatal or permanent, the state could secure the absolute dominance of the creditor class. The fear of the debt contract became as potent as the fear of the sword. The visual presence of the laws in the agora served as a constant psychological weight on every inhabitant of the city. The axons were large, four-sided wooden pillars that could be rotated to show different sections of the code. People would gather around them in uneasy silence, watching as the literate among them read aloud the grim reality of their new existence. The word death appeared with such rhythmic regularity that it seemed to pulse from the wood itself. Draco understood that visibility was a key component of terror. By placing the instruments of their destruction in the middle of the marketplace, he ensured that no citizen could ever claim ignorance. This was a form of public intimidation that reached into the most mundane aspects of life. Even a merchant accidentally using a slightly inaccurate scale or a traveler taking a forbidden path could find themselves facing an immediate trial where the only possible verdict was the ultimate one. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the transparent tyranny. Draco proved that a ruler does not need to hide his crimes if he can successfully rebrand them as the inevitable requirements of the law. The agora, once a place of vibrant debate and commerce, became a cathedral of fear. The elite families who had initially welcomed Draco's severity soon realized that they had created a system that demanded a constant supply of offenders to justify its own existence. To maintain the illusion of absolute order, the state had to be seen as constantly active, constantly vigilant, and constantly punishing. This led to a culture of state-sponsored denunciation, where citizens were encouraged to report even the slightest suspicion of a crime. In a city where a minor theft led to the gallows, an accusation became a lethal weapon. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades began to watch each other with a predatory intensity, knowing that a single whispered word to a magistrate could eliminate a rival or settle an old grudge. Draco's laws did not just punish crime, they incentivized betrayal. This atmosphere of pervasive mistrust shattered the social fabric of Athens, replacing community loyalty with a terrified, individualistic focus on personal survival. This demonstrates the terrifying historical function of the perfect law. Draco showed that by making the stakes of social interaction life or death, the state can effectively isolate every citizen, leaving them powerless against the central authority. One of the most bizarre and unsettling aspects of draconian justice was its application to inanimate objects and animals. If a stone fell from a building and killed a person, or if an animal caused a fatal injury, Draco's code required that the object or the beast be formally tried in a court of law. If found guilty, the object or animal was solemnly cast out beyond the borders of the city. While this may seem absurd to the modern mind, the terrifying truth behind this practice was Draco's obsession with the purity of the Athenian state. He believed that any source of disorder, even a mindless stone, carried a ritual pollution that had to be purged to satisfy the gods and the law. This was a form of total legalism that allowed no exceptions and recognized no accidents. By putting stones and animals on trial, Draco was signaling that his reach was absolute, extending even into the world of the non-human. This illustrates the terrifying historical reach of the fanatical legislator. Draco proved that when a ruler is obsessed with absolute order, they will eventually seek to legislate the behavior of the entire universe, turning the world into a massive, cold courtroom. The silence that descended upon Athens under Draco's rule was not the silence of a well-governed society, but the silence of a population that had been collectively traumatized. The streets grew quiet as the sun set, and the vibrant, often chaotic energy of the early city-state was replaced by a rigid, artificial calm. Draco viewed this silence as his greatest achievement, a sign that the blood-written laws had successfully tamed the rebellious spirit of the people. However, beneath this frozen surface, a profound and dangerous resentment was beginning to boil. The common people realized that they had traded the unpredictable cruelty of the nobles for the predictable cruelty of a monster, and the elite realized that they were presiding over a city of ghosts. The laws had achieved order, but they had destroyed the life of the city. This illustrates the fundamental historical flaw of rule through terror. Draco showed that you can silence a population with the threat of death, but you cannot force them to support a state that offers them nothing but the grave. The code was perfect, the order was absolute, and the city was dying. We have seen the machinery of his justice, but the moment when the people finally broke under the weight of the blood-written word is yet to come. The absolute nature of Draco's laws created a social vacuum where the concept of mercy was not just forgotten, but effectively outlawed as a form of state-level treason. In this period of Athenian history, the magistrate who dared to show leniency to a hungry child or a confused traveler was himself viewed as a threat to the divine order of the city. The terrifying truth behind the Draconian Code was its total rejection of human context. The law existed in a sterile, frozen space where the why of a crime was entirely irrelevant. This led to a series of public spectacles that were as technically legal as they were morally repulsive. Families were forced to watch as their breadwinners were taken to the cliffs or the executioner's block for crimes that in any other age would have required nothing more than a simple apology or a small fine. This systematic destruction of the family unit served a dark political purpose, as it stripped the common people of their last source of emotional and financial support, leaving them entirely dependent on the cold charity of the state or the whims of their creditors. This demonstrates the terrifying historical reality of a state that seeks to replace all human bonds with the singular, vertical bond of the law. Draco showed that by criminalizing basic human survival, a ruler can effectively turn an entire population into a collection of desperate, isolated subjects who are too afraid to even mourn their dead. The psychological pressure of living under a code written in blood began to manifest in a collective paranoia that infected every level of Athenian society, from the highest council to the lowest dock worker. The fear was not just of the punishment itself, but of the absolute certainty that once the machinery of the law began to move, it could never be stopped. Draco had designed a system with no appeal process and no room for reconsiderations. The moment a stylus touched a wax tablet to record an accusation, the fate of the accused was sealed. This certainty created a state of permanent high-level stress that led to a strange and unsettling phenomenon where people began to withdraw from public life altogether to minimize their risk of being noticed by the law. The marketplaces grew empty, and the once vibrant public debates that would later define Greek democracy were silenced by the overwhelming presence of the axons. People communicated in whispers and avoided eye contact, knowing that a single misunderstood gesture could be interpreted as a violation of some obscure, lethal subsection of the code. This illustrates the fundamental historical truth that absolute legal clarity often results in total social paralysis. Draco proved that when the law is too clear about its desire for blood, the people will eventually choose the safety of the shadows over the dangers of the light. One of the most chilling and hidden aspects of Draco's reign was the way he used the legal code to consolidate the power of the priesthood and the religious elite, framing his laws as divine revelations that could not be questioned without committing sacrilege. Every execution was rebranded as a purification of the city, a necessary ritual to appease the gods and prevent cosmic disaster. This religious layer added a terrifying depth to the legal terror, as it meant that the victim was not only an enemy of the state, but a sinner in the eyes of the divine. The executioners were treated as holy ministers, and the process of trial was surrounded by complex, intimidating rituals designed to overwhelm the senses of the accused. The terrifying reality of this theocratic legalism was that it allowed no room for intellectual or political dissent. To question Draco was to question the gods themselves. This demonstrates the ultimate historical danger of a ruler who uses religious fear to reinforce the power of a lethal legal system. Draco showed that when the state claims to speak for the heavens, the gallows become a sacred altar where the life of the citizen is the primary sacrifice. The economic reality of Athens under Draco's laws turned into a spiral of debt and despair that effectively re-established a form of hereditary slavery through legal means. While the laws claimed to be equal for all, the reality was that the wealthy could afford to navigate the system, while the poor were systematically stripped of their remaining rights. The draconian approach to property meant that the loss of land was inevitably followed by the loss of personal freedom. This created a massive, growing underclass of people who were legally free but practically enslaved to the aristocratic families who controlled the courts. The tension between the growing number of the dispossessed and the increasingly paranoid elite reached a breaking point where the city began to feel like a powder keg waiting for a single spark. Draco's response to this tension was not to reform the economy, but to sharpen the laws even further, believing that if the people were terrified enough, they would never dare to revolt. This illustrates the historical pattern of the tyrant who tries to solve systemic inequality through increased state violence. Draco proved that while you can use the law to seize a man's land and his freedom, you cannot use it to suppress the simmering rage that comes from a life of total, legalized hopelessness. The ultimate, most terrifying secret of Draco's legacy is the story of his own demise, an event that serves as a bizarre and fitting conclusion to a life defined by the absolute weight of his own rules. History suggests that Draco did not fall to a traditional coup or a violent rebellion. Instead, he was reportedly suffocated by the very people who claimed to honor him. During a visit to the theater on the island of Aegina, the audience, in a traditional Greek gesture of respect and approval, began to throw their cloaks and hats onto the legislator. The crowd was so large and their honor so overwhelming that Draco was buried alive under the literal weight of their garments, unable to breathe beneath the pile of fabric. Whether this story is literal truth or a powerful historical metaphor, the message is chillingly clear. The man who had burdened his people with the weight of an unyielding, lethal code was eventually crushed by the collective weight of their support. This illustrates the profound historical irony of the legal tyrant. Draco showed that even the most powerful legislator can be destroyed by the very population they sought to domesticate through fear. The man of blood was silenced by a mountain of cloth, leaving behind a city that was desperate to erase his name from the stones of their history. We have witnessed the peak of his terror, but the moment when the blood-written words were finally wiped away is the final chapter of this dark history. The pervasive shadow of Draco's code did more than just regulate behavior. It fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of Athens, turning the city into a cold monument to the concept of the absolute state. Under the weight of the Draconian laws, the vibrant intellectual life that would later become the hallmark of Greek civilization was effectively strangled in its crib. The terrifying truth is that when a society is forced to live in a state of perpetual legal terror, the first casualty is creativity and the willingness to question the status quo. In Draco's Athens, to be different was to be dangerous, and to be innovative was to risk being perceived as a threat to the rigid order of the law. This led to a period of cultural stagnation, where the only art that flourished was that which glorified the state and the terrifying clarity of its justice. The citizens became experts in the art of invisibility, learning to suppress their own individuality to avoid the cold gaze of the magistrates. This demonstrates the ultimate historical cost of total legalism. Draco showed that by making the law perfect and unyielding, you effectively kill the spirit of the people it was meant to protect. The silence of the city was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a collective intellectual and emotional coma. The enforcement of the Draconian Code required a level of state surveillance that turned the concept of privacy into a memory of a forgotten age. Because the penalties were so severe, the state had to ensure that its presence was felt in every corner of the city, from the busiest harbor to the most remote farmhouse. This was achieved through a network of informants and minor officials who were empowered to report any sign of disorder to the Council of the Areopagus. The terrifying reality of this system was its absolute lack of accountability. An accusation was often enough to trigger a process that ended on the executioner's block. People began to fear their own servants, their own neighbors, and even their own family members, knowing that a single misplaced word could be interpreted as a capital offense. This systematic destruction of social trust was not an accidental byproduct of the laws, but a calculated strategy to ensure that no organized resistance could ever form. This illustrates the terrifying historical pattern of the surveillance state. Draco proved that by making everyone a potential informant, you turn the entire population into a self-policing prison, where the fear of the neighbor is more potent than the fear of the soldier. One of the most hidden and disturbing aspects of this era was the way the Draconian laws were used to sanitize the Athenian population, removing those who were deemed socially or economically inconvenient under the guise of legal purity. The death penalty for minor thefts and the laws regarding debt bondage served as a mechanism for social cleansing, where the poor and the marginalized were systematically eliminated or enslaved to the elite. Draco's belief that small crimes were a sign of deep-seated corruption meant that the state was effectively waging a war against its own vulnerable citizens. This was a form of legal eugenics, where the law was used to weed out those who did not fit the rigid, productive mold of the ideal Athenian subject. The terrifying reality of this practice was the absolute indifference of the court to the suffering it caused. The law was a machine, and the lives it consumed were merely the fuel needed to keep it running. This demonstrates the ultimate historical danger of viewing the law as a tool for purifying society. Draco showed that when the state begins to value the abstract concept of order over the physical reality of human life, it becomes a monster that feeds on its own people. The economic fallout of the Draconian era created a class of living ghosts, citizens who had been stripped of their land and their freedom, but remained within the city as a reminder of the state's absolute power. These individuals, bound by debts they could never repay and governed by laws that offered them no mercy, became a simmering source of resentment that threatened to burn the city to the ground. Draco's refusal to address the root causes of their despair, choosing instead to focus on the absolute enforcement of the creditor's rights, pushed Athens to the very edge of a violent, bloody revolution. The elite, sheltered within their fortified estates, lived in a state of paranoid luxury, knowing that their wealth was secured by a system that was increasingly hated by the vast majority of the population. This illustrates the historical fragility of a society built on legalized exploitation and systemic fear. Draco proved that you can use the law to freeze a conflict in place for a time, but you cannot stop the heat of human rage from eventually melting the ice. The blood-written words were beginning to blur as the city prepared for the inevitable collapse of the Draconian order. The ultimate chilling legacy of this period is the way it served as a dark template for future tyrants throughout history, providing a perfect example of how to use the rule of law to justify absolute cruelty. Draco's genius was not in his capacity for violence, but in his ability to clothe that violence in the respectable language of legal necessity and divine order. He showed that you don't need to be a traditional tyrant to destroy a population. You just need to be a perfect, unyielding legislator who believes that the state is more important than the soul. The memory of his laws remained a permanent scar on the Athenian identity, a reminder of a time when the city had nearly committed collective suicide in the name of order. This illustrates the fundamental historical lesson of the Draconian era, that the greatest threat to a society often comes not from the lawless, but from those who seek to make the law absolute. Draco was the first to prove that the most terrifying cage is the one built from the words of the law. We have reached the final hour of his reign, where the people of Athens must choose between the blood-written code and the possibility of a different, more human future. The collapse of the Draconian order did not come as a sudden explosion of violence, but as a slow, agonizing realization that a city governed by the grave could not sustain the living. By the time Draco's reign drew to its bizarre and suffocating end, Athens was a hollow shell of its former self, with its economy paralyzed and its citizens living in a state of terminal despair. The terrifying truth is that Draco's laws had been so successful at enforcing order that they had effectively killed the city's ability to function as a human community. The aristocratic elite, who had once viewed Draco as their savior, found themselves presiding over a wasteland of debt-ridden slaves and silent streets. The transition away from the blood-written code began with the rise of Solon, a man who understood that true stability is found not in the absolute clarity of the law, but in its capacity for equity and human preservation. Solon's first act was the sysachthaia, the shaking off of burdens, which involved the immediate and total cancellation of all debts that had led to bondage. This was a direct, systemic rejection of the Draconian belief that property was more sacred than life. This illustrates the ultimate historical failure of the Draconian experiment. Draco showed that you can create a perfect legal machine, but if that machine consumes the very people it is meant to serve, the people will eventually rise up and smash it to pieces. The blood-written tablets were not just revised, they were spiritually and legally exorcised from the heart of the city. The memory of Draco survived not as a guide for future leaders, but as the ultimate historical warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked legalism and the dehumanizing power of the absolute state. For centuries after his death, Athenian orators and philosophers used the term Draconian to describe the worst kind of tyranny, the kind that hides its cruelty behind the mask of judicial necessity. The terrifying reality of his legacy is that it forced the ancient world to develop the concepts of intent and proportionality, realizing that a law that cannot distinguish between a mistake and a crime is itself a form of criminal violence. Draco's failure was the catalyst for the birth of Greek democracy, as it proved that justice must be a collective, human process rather than a cold, divine decree. This demonstrates the profound historical law of unintended consequences. Draco sought to freeze Athens in a state of permanent aristocratic order, but he instead triggered a series of reforms that would eventually empower the very citizens he sought to silence. The black ink of Solon's laws eventually replaced the blood of Draco's code, but the scars remained deep in the Athenian identity. The ultimate and most unsettling secret of the Draconian era is the persistent appeal of his methods to those who find themselves in times of chaos and social fragmentation. Throughout history, in moments of deep national crisis, voices have always emerged calling for draconian measures to restore order, proving that the spirit of the ancient Athenian legislator is never truly dead. The terrifying truth is that the desire for absolute, unyielding justice is a dormant part of the human psyche, waiting for fear and uncertainty to bring it back to the surface. Draco's story is a reminder that the path to total tyranny often begins with a simple, popular demand for law and order. This illustrates the fundamental historical danger of the quick fix for social problems. Draco proved that while you can use a sword to prune a garden, you will eventually find that you have cut down the entire forest. His name became a curse, but his methods remained a temptation for every tyrant who followed. The final physical erasure of Draco's laws from the Athenian agora marked the true birth of the city as a center of culture and law. The wooden axones were removed, and the laws were rewritten on stone pillars called stelae, with many of the death penalties replaced by fines and exile. Only the laws regarding homicide remained, as even his successors recognized that some of Draco's work on distinguishing between intentional and accidental killing had a grain of judicial merit. This small remnant was the only part of his blood-written legacy that was allowed to survive into the classical age. The rest was cast into the dust, a symbolic act of a society reclaiming its own humanity from the grip of a monster. This demonstrates the historical power of collective memory to correct the path of a civilization. Athens survived Draco, but only by choosing to remember him as the man who had nearly destroyed them with his perfect justice. The silence of fear was finally replaced by the noise of the democratic assembly. We have revealed the entire horrifying truth of the man who wrote laws in blood. Now, we turn the final question to you, the crown of dread audience. Draco, faced with a city on the brink of civil war, used the total terror of the death penalty to enforce an absolute and immediate order that arguably saved Athens from total collapse in the short term. Do you believe that a ruler is justified in using extreme, lethal legal measures to stabilize a society in crisis, even if those measures cost the city its soul? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history, and find the truth buried beneath the oldest thrones.